There's a great deal of attention being devoted to extending the lifespan. But what about the health span? The period of our lives during which we are not simply continuing to have a pulse, but rather that period during which we're healthy and we're productive. I think that's the period we care about, right? Well, today we have one of the foremost experts on this subject, the head of the Healthspan Lab at Colorado State University, Dr. Tom LaRocca, on the show. He and his team study what is happening beneath the surface as we age and how we can utilize those findings to extend that period of health and impact. That period of life, I think, we all care most about. Thank you for joining us here on the Catalyst 360 podcast, your source for engaging, evidence-based health, wellness, and high-performance insights. I'm your host, Dr. Brad Cooper, CEO of Catalyst Coaching 360, and this is such an incredible time of year with so much energy and engagement around making positive changes in our lives. We appreciate you allowing us to be a part of your journey each week. If you've been considering pursuing your MBHWC-approved certification as a health and wellness coach, now's the perfect time. The training is done virtually while emphasizing the personal connection with your instructors, mentor coaches, and others. It is a big decision. We get that. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you want to set up a time to talk it over, not with some salesperson, but you'll actually get a chance to talk to our Chief Learning Officer and lead instructor, the one and only Susanna Cooper. Reach out to her, Susanna at catalystcoaching360.com, to set up a time to discuss your unique career and life path. And now, it's time to bring the biology to life with Dr. Tom LaRocca on the latest episode of the Catalyst 360 podcast. Let's kick things off by providing some framework for our discussion. It seems every podcast, every video out there is about lifespan. That's not what we're talking about today. We're focused on health span. Explain the difference between health span and lifespan and why you're looking at that.
So I think the easiest way to think about it is as a mashup of two terms, and that would be sort of healthy lifespan, and that for some people makes it a bit easier. So the basic idea is that you certainly want to live as long as you can, but you'd rather not spend half your life, a third of your life, or even 25% of your life in poor health. It would be nice to live really well and, kick the bucket quickly. You're making that motion with your hand.
Yeah, fall off a cliff at that point.
Live long, die fast, right? Yeah.
So in your lab then, you obviously get into the science of aging. Can you get into some of the kind of the key findings, breakthroughs, either your research or related research has found in terms of the fundamental process of aging?
Mm-hmm. So the fundamental process of aging really comes down to things that are happening at the cellular level. And people over the last decade or so, and longer than that, I should say, have really tried to drill down on this and narrow in on molecular or cellular events that we know happen during aging, kind of get worse as we get older and contribute to what we would experience as actual aging, typically get worse when you develop a disease.
Sure.
A disease of aging, that is. And then the criteria for something to be what we call a hallmark of aging, and that's a term that's used in our research field quite often, hallmark of aging, is that it fits all of the descriptions that I just listed, but then also if you accelerate it or exacerbate it, it'll make the aging process accelerate or go faster. And if you can stop it or reverse it, it'll actually slow down the aging process. So
let's step off the academic chain for a second here and just talk realities. It seems to me, just talking to friends, people, age is the excuse that creates its own outcome in so many cases. Yes, some people, there's a cancer that kicks in. There's some kind of thing that takes over. But in so many people, it seems like I get older because I chose to get older. And obviously that's exaggerated. But do you see that in your research? I just stopped going to the track. I don't want to do the hard workouts anymore. Okay, so I slow down. So now maybe I don't know. I'm accelerating this quite a bit, but do you see that in your findings at all?
Yeah, so in my lab, we're really focused on those biological events, and as you can imagine, it's
Right.
really hard to figure out if you look at somebody's cells whether they have that trait or have decided to, or really, I guess it's not decided to age poorly, but just resigned themselves
Yeah.
to aging poorly, right? I do think that's very real. One of the things that I've always loved about aging and healthy aging and studying it is that it's such a big topic. It's really integrated.
Huge.
There's all the crazy biology that's going on, and then there's the psychology of it. And as you know, there's some folks in town here who study it from that angle
Right.
too. So again, it's not something that we directly study so much in our lab, but what we are interested in is a little bit related, is the fact that there's a difference between what people call biological age and chronological age.
Okay.
So chronological age is how old you are in years,
The number.
clock time,
Right.
right? And then biological age is like the health of your cells, the health of your body and your organs and that sort of thing. And there's some evidence for what you're describing, and not from my lab, I should say, but there is some evidence that you can detect at least a bit of that at the biological level if you think about biological versus chronological age. But I agree with you very much. I used to be a track coach. I was a high school track coach for a number
Very
of
cool.
years. Yeah, and there was a guy that would be showing up at the track as we were wrapping up practice every day, and he was in his late 40s, and decades prior, he had been a really high-level NCAA 400-meter runner, and he was out there just, killing it, right, doing really hard quarters over and over. And I remember kind of talking with him one day and just getting his philosophy and if there's anything he could share with the high school track athletes. And he said, I'm making a big deal out of a story with a really simple punchline, but his big thing was just use it or lose it. And
Yeah.
I think that's so real.
Huge. Well, and you even see it with the high school kids. You would always cross country season. You knew who ran over the summer. Like it wasn't the talented athlete. It was
Totally.
who ran. We know. Mm-hmm. Don't tell me. Let's see what your 5K time is. Fascinating. So as you're doing your research, and I'm getting completely off topic here because I love this stuff. Are you collecting the lifestyle data going into that? So you know that, yeah, Joe is in the gym 3 times a week. Joe is hiking, blah, blah, blah. Or are we focused specifically on the chronological versus the cellular changes that we're seeing?
Yeah, we are collecting the lifestyle data too. So we want to know that. We so far have not really gotten into the finer details of what makes, there's a spectrum, I guess, is what I'm getting at, right? So some people are going to be very far onto the what I would argue is the good side of the spectrum, where you're using it so that you don't lose it, and others have resigned a bit more. And trying to piece apart who's where on the spectrum, I think, is probably challenging. But what we do is we kind of compare folks who are habitual exercisers, kind of exercise in most days of the week and have been for a long time, versus people who are the opposite. And that, just making that large distinction really allows us to kind of iron out and draw out some differences at the biological level, which might be harder to do if we were looking at the broader spectrum. It's more of a continuum.
And do people lie? I mean, seriously, I always say people always overestimate how many hours they work and underestimate the breaks that they take and the food they eat and that kind of stuff. Is your sense that those subjective surveys you're using or whatever are pretty accurate? Or does the person who says, oh yeah, I'm at the gym 4 times a week, you're like, really?
Probably. Yeah, no, you're probably right. I'll say they must be honest enough. They must be reasonably honest, because the data that we collect on their cells and the proteins, you can see pretty big differences in the folks who do and don't exercise on a regular basis.
And then you mentioned this biological versus chronological age. Is there you see a lot of stuff online about that. Hey, what's your real age? What's your blah, blah?
Right.
Do you have a assessment you like? Do you have something you guys have created internally?
Yeah, I think that's kind of a million, billion, whatever you want to call it, dollar question in the research field, and even in the industry field too. There are companies that want to sell you biological, chronological aging clocks and that sort of thing. and this is something that we're actively doing research on. And I'll just say that my take is that we're not quite there yet, in that we don't have a clock that reflects biological aging or a measurement that reflects biological age accurately enough to really recommend it with any great confidence. In fact, what's kind of funny is that there's some really simple things that you can ask people, and like in terms of like how old do you feel? Do you feel older than your age in years? And if the answer is yes, then it turns out that actually is a pretty accurate reflector of their health outcomes down the road, which kind of is getting at biological age. So maybe we don't need a fancy molecular toolkit or something like that.
So no specific blood tests that you would encourage the layperson to request from their doc that might give them something insightful?
I know there's a lot of info out there. I think that what I would suggest, at least, and the important caveat is that I'm not an MD.
Right.
I'm the other guy.
Absolutely.
Right.
You know that, folks.
Yeah. Is that just getting those regular checkups and checking in with your doc to see what are the age appropriate bloods that you should be having run and that sort of thing. And they've changed over the years a bit, right? I think the big ones are sort of the cardiovascular risk factor markers, your cholesterol and typical things that people get. But, some people in their 40s and even early 50s aren't getting that yearly checkup and maybe don't know that they should be getting measurement of blood glucose and hemoglobin A1C and those kinds of things. Yeah. So
I remember watching what was that show, Biggest Loser? Our family used to like to watch that when when the kids were young. And I remember this young man was morbidly obese, and they sat down with him and said, "You have diabetes," and he just broke into tears because he had no idea. Yeah. And the doctor was like, "You had no idea? Like, how did you not know?" He's like, "Oh, well, I just thought I'm not healthy, I'm overweight, but at least I don't have diabetes." So yes, that regular annual stuff is so important. All right, I've written a bunch of stuff to shut down, but let's stay with what I was planning to ask you here for a minute. The interplay between genetics and lifestyle choices, huge element. There's more and more research coming out about epigenetics, and the way that you live out is 70%, and the actual genetics are 30%. I just made that number up off the top of my head. We had Kenneth Pelletier. I don't know if you've read some of his stuff, but we had him on the show, and I think he'd given something around those numbers. But talk us through your thoughts on that, and what you're finding, and what your perspective would be on the epigenetics or the lifestyle versus genetics element.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard similar numbers, and if you had asked me to kind of come up with some random numbers that, might check out if somebody went and scrutinized the literature, I probably would have said something like that.
In the ballpark.
Yeah, in the ballpark. I guess the layer of detail that I'll add to that is that, so first, just to start at the top, I think that all of the above is very important. As you say, what's the relative contribution? It's probably roughly 30%, maybe 40% genetics. And it depends who you ask. The layer of detail I want to add to that is that it might be easy to think that means that there's a couple of genes that if you could get a test on 23andMe, it would tell you if you're going to live to 100 or have a nice long health span or something like that. But it turns out that it's much more complicated than that. So
makes sense.
Yeah, there's very, very few individual genes that actually have any kind of association with health or lifespan. And when people use numbers like 30% or whatever, what they're really referring to is that we would call it a polygenic trait or outcome, meaning there's multiple genes that influence the probability of you living long and living well. And they might be different genes for you than for me. Right. So it gets really complicated.
And again, everyone listening knows I'm preaching to the choir here, but it just seems like when you realize that only 30%, I'm going to use the phrase only,
sure, let's go with that,
30% or even 40% is genetic. I hear genetics being the well, I don't have a choice, so I guess I'm just not going to be healthy. And when the reality comes out and says, well, yeah, you got one strike, but you get three. And we're talking 30%. That's about one of the three strikes. What are you going to do with the other two at bats? It just seems so powerful. Do you see that come out in either the people that read your research, the participants in your studies? Like, are they tuning into this opportunity that, okay, yeah, we got one strike. We're just getting started, baby.
Yeah, no, I think you're onto something really important there. And you know what, I'll circle it back actually to the earlier question too about epigenetics, because I didn't even really address that. So yeah, maybe you get dealt a bad hand if we knew what all the right genes to look at, where we could figure that out. But the idea behind epigenetics is that you might actually be able to even modulate your bad hand
the way it is
too,
exactly.
Right? So maybe you've got that one strike, but you've got the others, and you might as well do something about that. And in doing so, you might actually favorably affect the bad hand that you got dealt at the genetic level.
That's powerful. So, good. Yeah. Excellent reminder. Very good. Are there, I think I know part of the answer to this, but I want to hear you talk it through, specific lifestyle factors that really kind of bubble to the top in terms of this health span component? And again, folks, what we're talking about with health span is not how long you live, it's how long you matter. And I'm exaggerating that a little bit, but it's you're healthy and you're having an impact. You're being productive. You're participating in the community, in what's happening in the world, et cetera. So are there certain lifestyle choices, decisions that bubble to the top in terms of the biggest impact on that health span, that healthy, impactful life?
Yeah, I love what you said too. I've never heard. Can you repeat that? It's not.
I don't think I can. I made it up.
How long you live? Did you just make that up?
Yeah, that's what we were talking.
Nice yeah, it's not how long you live; it's how long you matter. I think that's what you said.
Yeah, good recall.
That's great, right? And that's important too, because it's not just about being healthy, right? It's about being plugged in and being a contributing member to society, your family, your friends, really kind of at multiple levels. So, it's going to be stuff that surprises no one. And I'm biased too, I should say, but exercise, physical activity rises to the top for me. And then a healthy diet. And then I think most of the other things, and if you wanted to put a bit more of a pin in the exercise and the healthy diet too, you might ask, well, what does that look like?
Yes, right? Definitely. That was my follow-up.
Yeah. To me, some of the best evidence in support of how to think about those things comes from this concept of the blue zones.
Yep.
I'm sure you're familiar.
We had him on.
Dan.
Yeah.
Dan Buettner?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. I say it like I know him, but I do not.
Oh, yeah, Dan. How you doing, buddy?
We go way back. No. Never met him, read all the books, though. Yeah, I think it's great work. And for people who don't know, I guess the quick recap, right, is that there are several regions of the world where sort of a surprising number of people live beyond the age of 100.
Yes.
It's longevity hotspots or blue zones. And the thought was when this was first recognized, the idea was that, we could go there and learn something about what's kind of biologically different about these folks, because maybe there's some genetic differences and that sort of thing. And there may be, but really what's fallen out of the research on trying to understand what's going on in the blue zones is lifestyle habits and patterns that seem to be in common.
Right.
And so it's kind of regular physical activity, but not necessarily hardcore exercise. So you don't have to be training for a marathon or the Ironman.
Right.
You can. Nobody's going to get upset, right? But daily movement, and not just a little bit of daily movement, but a significant amount of daily movement. Healthy diet that is kind of modest in calories, modest in intake of most of the food groups. So I'm fascinated by nutrition, and I think there's really cool evidence for various diets, but most of the really long-standing evidence that we have comes from places like, or examples like the Mediterranean diet, right? And that food pattern, the general kind of macronutrient distribution of that is at least sort of common across the blue zones.
No doubt.
And then, as you know, since Dan was on the podcast already, the other common thread is kind of community and social connections and networks.
Yeah, he talks a lot about that. It was
Purpose,
really interesting.
I guess, too, right?
And the way your community is structured, so it's natural to be getting together. It's not a choice. It comes back. We had BJ Fogg and Wendy Wood on it with habit stuff, and they all the habit folks emphasize, make the better choice the easy choice. And that's what Dan's talking about, is live in a place where the better choice is the easy choice. You don't have to make this like grit-based decision every single day. Right. It just happens. It's just who you are. It's just the life you're living. So yeah, that's really good. It's funny. There's been some recent info on the blue zones, not take away at all from what Dan's done and the insights there, but that poor birth certificate records may have made that look a little better than we thought. But regardless, it's good. It's good insights. All right. So you mentioned physical activity, healthy diet. You came back to the community piece. Is there anything else that kind of bubbles up? And the funny thing is, for all the bro science fans out there, you're waiting for the magical supplement. Oh, if you just take this one thing, we've seen a 20% improvement. It's not there, is it?
Not yet. No, you may know that there is interest in that, right? So there's a lot of folks who are really interested.
The $1 billion question, like you said.
Yeah, for sure. And there's industry interest in that as well, as in addition to a ton of research and academic areas in that on that same topic. But I think that I think most supplements that there are certainly some supplements out there that have beneficial effects on certain aspects of human physiology. To my knowledge, there's nothing for which there's really great evidence in terms of lifespan and health span and making you matter for longer.
Yeah.
To go back to that. But again, there is a lot of interest in trying to determine if anything will fit that description. So there's, as people might know, that there's just starting this big trial on metformin, which is a decades-old anti-diabetic drug that has lots of good data, lab-based data, outside of the fact that it's been used to treat diabetes for a long time, showing that it actually can increase health span and lifespan. And
interesting.
It really has very few side effects, and so there's some interest in trying to determine whether that's sort of a bona fide anti-aging. It'd be a drug, really, not a supplement. Right. But yeah.
Have you looked at all at individualized gaps? So we'll talk a lot about tests to address. So don't just take vitamin D. Take vitamin D if you have a gap. Don't just take melatonin, or not melatonin, but magnesium. Take magnesium because you have a gap. Like, instead of just blanketing it with 17 supplements that cost you $500 a month, do your blood tests, find out where your gap is, and fill the gap. Does that happen to tie into anything that you're looking at in terms of if you fill those gaps, then there are some benefits to health span?
It does, but not super directly, and I can explain that. So we don't actually measure any of those things in the people that we study. I do think there's a place for that. So if you're vitamin D deficient, especially as you're getting older, we know that increases your risk for almost everything. Right. You should probably supplement with vitamin D. So that's the kind of stuff that if you get customized or precision blood panels done, or even some of those are tests that you can go in and just order on your own pretty easily, that can be really helpful, I think. We don't really directly measure or study those things in the folks that we study. And that's mostly because we're sort of up one level in terms of biology, down one level, I guess, if we're going smaller. So what we are very interested in this idea of personalized or precision medicine, depending on what you want to call it. And that it intersects back with those aging clocks that I was talking about before. And I'm not sure if I explained them clearly enough, but the basic idea is that if you knew what to measure, and I'm not talking about vitamins or minerals or anything like that, but if you knew what epigenetic signatures or genes or proteins to look at in a blood sample from somebody, you might be able to pinpoint pretty quickly which sort of age-related processes are unfolding the most rapidly and maybe contributing to their health span declining more quickly than they would like. So one of the best examples, I think, is inflammation. So inflammation is, I mentioned, hallmarks of aging. Yeah. Inflammation is kind of one of the biggest, most ubiquitous, all-affecting hallmarks of aging. And if we could figure out and identify what some of the sort of upstream causes of inflammation are in people, and if we had the right test to figure out that somebody's systemic or age-related inflammation is proceeding at a rapid rate, then maybe that's something that we could intervene with. But I think that's pretty futuristic too.
Well, let's sit on that for a second. So inflammation, how are you testing that? Because obviously inflammation in short bursts is a positive because that's how we get stronger, faster, smarter. So how are you testing it on can you tell what inflammation has been present in the body for more than a week or month, or how do you go about that to peel out the inflammation that's causing this degradation versus the inflammation that you're like, yeah, way to go, buddy.
Right. Yeah, so you're absolutely right. So acute inflammation is protective, right? You get an injury or an infection, virus or something like that. You want your inflammation to ramp up to fight it off. So
or a workout.
Or a workout,
yeah.
Right? That's right. Absolutely. Yep. So it turns out actually that many of the same things that you would measure as markers of acute inflammation are what you would also measure for what we would call chronic or age-related inflammation. So you've hit on something important, which is it is difficult to dissect those two. But that's where what we do is we try to do sort of very broad molecular profiling. When we take a blood sample from somebody, we look at the DNA and the RNA and the proteins that are in there. And what we get to capture in that way is a bigger picture of what's going on again at the cellular level that can at least give you some insight into whether what you're seeing is kind of more like acute inflammation or it's this chronic inflammation. I guess I should back that up too and say that, like, if somebody comes into the lab and they have a cold or something like that, then we don't want to study them that day. It's going to be clearly an acute inflammation scenario. Okay. And what you see in general is that markers of inflammation, and I think most people or many people, if they've had blood work done, would recognize like C-reactive protein or CRP. Quite often, doctors' offices order that. And if you have a viral infection, CRP will increase pretty quickly. But the same thing, that same protein also is associated with sort of longer, lower grade chronic inflammation, but it'll be at much lower levels. And so if we see increases in things like C-reactive protein or other, we'd say cytokines, so pro-inflammatory, inflammatory proteins, again, they might be the same ones that would increase after a workout or with some kind of infection. But if we see low-grade increases in, I guess, one, many of those, and then two, in other molecular samples that we collect, we can see evidence of just altered regulation of the biological pathways that would control them, then that gives us an idea that it's more like chronic inflammation, if that makes sense.
It does. I never asked you how you got into this. Like your background's fascinating, and people need to hear this. So you're a high school biology chemistry teacher. You're a track coach. How'd you get here? And then how did you not land on, but you're cutting edge. Like you're in the sweet spot of research right now with this topic you're pursuing. So how did you get 10,000 foot view? How'd you get from here to here and then end up striking gold with this, to me, fascinating lab that you've created?
Thanks for saying that.
Yeah.
10,000 foot view, dumb luck. No,
that's all of us.
I had no idea. No idea what I was doing when I started. And I've heard the analogy before of like, you're driving a car in the dark and you can only see as far as the headlights will illuminate for you. And so you just make the next best choice and that sort of thing. So yeah, and not very unintentionally, I guess is what I would say. I was a high school chemistry teacher, track coach and soccer coach at the time. I mentioned that. And then I thought that that's sort of what I wanted to do, to be in that world. But when I went to grad school, I got very unwittingly recruited to a lab that was studying aging because they were looking for somebody that had that skill set.
Right.
Because again, as I mentioned, aging is this very kind of integrative topic. And if you really want to study it comprehensively, you need to be looking at whole body health, psycho-emotional health, biological changes, and the list of things goes on and on. And so they were that particular lab was interested in establishing some more biochemical type measures of what was going on in cells. And I was a good fit for that. And I didn't really know much about grad school or what that looked like and how to be a grad student, how to do research. And I didn't know anything about aging. And if I'm being honest, when I first heard that that's what the lab studied, I thought, well, that seems kind of boring. But, you think about aging and you think about just end of life and diseases and that sort of thing. And I think that's very common, especially I was in my 20s at the time. Right? But
so over 40-year-olds were old then to you.
Yeah, for sure. So to finish that story, though, when I got into that world, I realized that it was this much bigger story about health across the lifespan, and what you do in your 20s affects you in your 30s, and your 30s affect your 40s, and all of the above affects your 80s very significantly, right? And that's kind of fascinating to me. And the fact that it's very integrative and involves molecular events and physiological and mental, and all the different levels, I think was just very cool to me. So, and then I just kind of made my way through that, did some research mostly on how the heart and arteries change with aging. And I kind of progressively steered what I was doing in a direction of focusing more on the kind of biological and molecular events, again, because that's where my interest typically has lied. And somewhere in the middle of that, my parents were actually aging too. Well, not actually, but everybody's parents are aging.
Of course, right? But they were in that phase.
Yeah, they were. Yeah, well, my mom actually developed leukemia when she was early in her 50s, and then she died in her early 60s.
Wow.
As a result of it. So it was a long drawn out thing and very unfortunate. And she may or may not have kind of dealt with it as well as she could have. But my dad was the caretaker in that scenario too. And
which is hard.
Incredibly hard. Yeah. So he almost experienced, not almost, I think he did experience sort of accelerated aging.
Yeah, you see that all the time.
Kind of see that in real time. And he ended up dying not too long after of a neurodegenerative disease, which may have been brewing in the background the whole time. But so all of that above on top of the research that I'm doing just gets me kind of fascinated in all of these different events that are intertwined and what's the best way to study them. And as a postdoc, I picked up this skill set of being able to do what some people call kind of big data science. So we take that blood sample and we're looking at DNA and RNA and all the proteins in your blood, and it's thousands and thousands and thousands of data points for one person.
Wow.
So that's a lot of what we do in the lab, and that there's other labs in the world that are really doing that at 10x the level that we are, but this is the whole personalized or precision medicine area really leverages all of those approaches. So.
In the Healthspan, did you identify your lab? I'm coming in to do this as you came to Colorado State University, or did they recruit you for the purpose of they already had designs on we want this lab? Did those two things come together? How did that become your baby?
Yeah. So CSU, as you know, has a Center for Healthy Aging. So there's an initiative and an interest in advancing this kind of research on campus. So they were looking for folks like that, but I was already doing that sort of thing. I had gotten my first grant at the time, and it was, I think Healthspan was actually in the title of the grant. So it was before I came here that I had developed that niche.
Okay. So interesting. All right. So I had to look this word up. Cellular senescence. Did I say it close to right? Senescence. Yep. Okay. So that's a big part of your research. Explain how this contributes to aging, age-related diseases. What strategies or interventions are you exploring that might help mitigate that a little bit? Talk us through that one. Teach us a new word today.
You bet. So cellular senescence is also a hallmark of aging, just like inflammation is a hallmark of aging. And again, what that means is that it tends to increase with aging and contribute to the declines that we all experience with aging. And if you increase cellular senescence, you accelerate the aging rate. Whereas if you decrease cellular senescence, you extend lifespan and or health span, if that all makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So the basic concept behind cellular senescence is that most but not all cells in our bodies are replicating with some frequency.
That's right.
And as they do, they kind of accumulate damage at the DNA level, other parts of the cell. And in a nutshell, they kind of have a finite capacity to replicate. So the replication rates of cells slow down over time. And at some point, they just stop replicating.
Okay.
And they enter a state that's known as cellular senescence.
So that's like a pause, or is it a death?
It's not a death.
Okay.
Yeah. And in fact, it's thought to be in some ways a protective response. So what would be the opposite of cellular senescence? It would be uncontrolled replication. And
Like
that
cancer.
sounds like cancer. Exactly.
Got it. So cell A replicates X thousands or millions of times over your life. The rate of replication slows down over time.
Correct.
But does the slowing take longer to continue to degrade if you're doing the things, the exercise, the eating well, that kind of stuff? Or is it able to replicate for a longer period, or do we not know the difference yet?
Yeah, I'm not sure we know the difference
Okay.
yet, but yes, things like exercise and all the other good stuff that we've been talking about have been shown to reduce cell senescence.
Okay. I'm just thinking of the old, like a billion years ago, and hopefully nobody listening to this still thinks this, but thought that your heart only has X number of heartbeats. So, don't exercise because you're using them up.
Right.
And obviously that's ridiculous, but I'm wondering if we create through positive choices a faster replication, it's not using that up. It's either extending it out or it's allowing more replication to take place. We're just not sure yet.
Yeah, we're not sure yet. And I guess the other layer to it is that one of the things that can accelerate, right? I should say another route to cellular senescence is by accumulating damage that doesn't have anything to do with replication. So people talk about stress-induced senescence. Okay. And what's probably happening in our bodies as we age is some of both. So cells are replicating, some of them replicate, and eventually slow down and just kind of stop. And others are just subjected to lots of stress, maybe high glucose or a lot of fat, free radicals, things like that will over time lead to an accumulation of damage in the cells that sets off some kind of signaling pathway in which the cell basically says, I got to stop replicating because I'm just dysfunctional now. I'm not doing my job. And it's kind of a double whammy because
like the cell gets burned out
instead
of the person.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And again, I'll add one more layer to that too, which is that there's two problems. One is that those senescent cells don't really do their jobs anymore. So, if it's a brain cell, maybe it's not firing on full steam. The other is that senescent cells tend to secrete lots of inflammatory factors, so they contribute to inflammation too, and all those kind of hallmarks of aging are very interrelated.
So when you're looking at stress, since that's a big part of this, is there a tool that are you checking cortisol? Are you looking at HRV scores? Is there two questions, I guess? One, what are you looking at? And then what can the layperson look at to kind of monitor that? We had Marco Altini, who created the HRV for training, which is a super easy way to check. Because I've always thought HRV is the coolest thing ever and the biggest hassle in the world. So I hadn't done it for years. And then he comes up with a super easy way. So now it's something that it's just what I do every morning. But have you found a tool that you use in the lab that may not be applicable to me, and B, something that our listeners would go, oh, I could check that?
Yeah. I've got an A for you, but not so much of a B.
Okay.
I think probably the best, easiest thing that people can measure if they wanted to get it measured would be cortisol. I guess that's B. Although I do think some of the wearables that are out there now, many
getting
of them
better.
They're getting better.
We're not there yet,
they got
but
something at least, right? honestly, it gets back to a little bit of what I was saying before about the aging clocks and comparing them to really simple questions like how old do you feel? Right? So how stressed do you feel?
Right.
And that's actually very important too, because as you guys have probably talked about this on the podcast before, I'm guessing that how you deal with stress actually matters a whole lot. Right. So
yeah, stress isn't a bad thing.
Right.
It's the supply and demand.
Right.
You may tolerate more stress in an academic setting than I would. I might tolerate it more in an entrepreneurial setting, somebody else more in the gym, somebody else more on the track. It's supply and demand. We had Rachel Cruz. I don't know if you're familiar with Dave Ramsey's Financial Peace Strategies, but that's his daughter who will probably end up taking over Ramsey stuff. And I was just thinking this stuff that you're studying is so similar to the financial side of, first of all, compounding interest. If you get a good running start with your finances in your 20s and 30s, it sets up because of the compounding effect of that. And you're saying the same thing with the cells and the way the body's created. And it's just interesting. I wonder, just popped in my head as you were talking, I thought, same thing. Like the compounding interest is what you're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, and I think there's great data on that too, right? So people who maintain, just one example would be like VO2 max. If you maintain a high VO2 max earlier in life, it's going to decline no matter what you do. You cannot stop that, but it will not decline as far just by virtue of the fact that you started higher. And I do think that's true about all of the biological aging stuff that we're talking about, but I would also add that what I would never want to do, and for good reason, would be to project the idea that you can't do anything about it, because it gets back to your strikes before, right?
100%.
So I think that where it's a little bit different is that in a way you can't turn back the clock necessarily and get a higher VO2 max 20 years ago. But the idea with some of these anti-aging drugs, and people are sticking with the senescent cells, is that maybe some of these things are actually wholesale reversible. Is that going to happen in our lifetimes? Maybe not, but the really most cutting edge research in this field is pointing to this idea that, for example, with senescent cells, that you might be able to kill them and get rid of them, and then just be left over with sort of healthier cells. Right. So this class of drugs that people are interested in is called senolytics that would kill senescent cells.
Interesting. Yeah, we've had several. We had the world record holder in the mile of the 90-year-old.
Really?
We've had a guy that has done the Ironman at age 80. We've had the 50-plus world record holder in the mile. And the pattern, intriguingly, is kind of similar. They started later.
Really?
So you're right. It's not just, it'd be great to have a great VO2 at 25. But folks, that ain't buying you retirement. You can start at 50. A lot of these top athletes that you see at the Masters track events and Ironmans and stuff, they got going in their 50s and they're killing the rest of us. So absolutely what you're saying. It's nice to have it. And yet what matters more is, what's the saying? Best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best day is today. So let's plant those trees, everybody.
Brad, can you put a pin in what the world record time for the 90-year-old mile is?
I can't remember. It's been 3 years since we interviewed him, but it was,
we can look
it was just so cool to talk to him, because you think of 90-year-olds trying to get off the couch,
right?
If they're lucky.
Right.
And this guy's out there. You're like, this is awesome.
It's amazing.
Yeah. It was really cool. And I went to the nationals for U.S. nationals a few years ago to run the mile, see how fast I could go at age 50. And there was a 100-meter race between, I think it was a 100-year-old and a 103-year-old. And we're all like, that was everyone's favorite event. We're all there trying to do our best, but we're all standing up and giving them a standing ovation because it was just awesome. They're like, we want to be them when we grow up. That's so cool.
It's so impressive. It really is. This might not be where you want to go necessarily, so stop me if you want to, but
we love rabbit trails here, so take it away.
We're on this topic. I often, when I'm giving public lectures and things, I'll start with this story, which is a true story, which is that I used to compete in triathlons, never did an Ironman, thought I would be able to someday, and I don't know. I think that ship has sailed. But,
We'll talk.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. But I would. This is in my early 20s. I remember, every race I would go with my brother. He was into it at the time too. Seeing these 70-year-olds and 80-year-olds doing these, Olympic distance, half Ironmans, whatever, and thinking, that is so cool. Awesome. Like, how can I be like that when I grow up, right? And I do think it connects with all the stuff that we're talking about, because what I've kind of come to appreciate, and I suspect other people would agree too, is that sure, maybe those folks got a little bit of a better deal on the genetics. That's possible.
Maybe.
But I also think that we're just all dealing with a ton of stuff as we get older. And if you lean into it and just get up off the couch anyway, you're just more likely to be out there still doing that.
Yeah. Well, it's Steve Magnus's Do Hard Things.
Right.
Like that. And I just saw a study today before you came over about the willingness to step into the difficult, and this doesn't mean go jump off a mountain and hope you survive, but the things that challenge you physically that aren't comfortable, and push through those anyway, set you up for the ability to do the things that you're talking about.
Absolutely.
The aging triathlete stuff, it's awesome watching them.
For sure.
They're incredible people. Wow, we could go through so many paths here. What you mentioned VO2 max. I was going to ask about that, because that seems to be one of the primary, if we want to say, biological age markers that we have. Mitochondrial length seems to be another one. I'm saying that with a question mark because this isn't my area. But what thoughts on both of those? Do you check VO2 max? Is it reasonable to check VO2 max in a 75-year-old? If so, what are the modifications you do with people that are like, well, I want you to test me, doc, but I haven't run, or I don't get on a bike, or what do you do with I guess take those separately. Talk to us about mitochondrial length and where does VO2 max fit or not fit into this equation?
Yeah, I think that VO2 max is kind of the mother of all markers of physiological health in a way. And there's really good data that show that VO2 max predicts health outcomes later in life. And that is, the higher it is, the less likely you are to develop diseases X, Y, and Z, or even to just die within a certain period of time. Right. So if the question is, what's the best measurement that you can do on somebody to predict their health span? Somebody could certainly look at the research that we do and say, what are you guys doing? We already know that it's VO2 max. And it's more complicated than that, right? It's not going to tell you necessarily about your cancer risk or something like that. But we do not do it for the simple reason that it's a hard thing to do. And that's one of the reasons that there's all this interest in some of the molecular measurements that labs like mine and others do, which is that we can't do VO2 max on everybody on the street, and especially on people who are getting older and more frail and are not regular exercisers. I will say that in the old lab that I worked in down at CU, we would put folks through max tests even in their 70s, and even people who typically were not exercisers, were habitually sedentary. And you have to have a trained physician there, and you've got to do it very carefully and that sort of thing. And some people won't be able to complete the test. But again, my bigger point is that the concept behind the personalized and precision medicine is that since we can't do VO2 max tests on everybody or any other sort of major physical tests, and there are other things I should say just on this note, things like average walking speed.
Yeah, that's a big one that insurance companies use.
Yeah. Average walking speed, grip strength is a phenomenal predictor of your mortality or death risk within a 10 or 15 year period. But again, you can't necessarily measure grip strength using the same tools and the same reliable methods in people all across the board. It wouldn't be a hard one to do in a doctor's office, but people don't. What you can do with most people is collect a blood sample. And if you knew what to look for in the blood, and you could look for maybe many more things than just grip strength or VO2 max, you could look for multiple proteins or multiple genes and that sort of thing, then maybe you could get a similarly accurate estimate of somebody's health trajectory, or maybe even more accurate in terms of understanding what's going on at the cell level.
Well, and for those, try this at home. Your 5K time can give you a pretty good indication of your VO2 max.
Yep. Right.
So obviously that doesn't work if you're in a boot like you are right now, but that might be interesting data to collect with your participants is, have you run a 5K in the last 12 months? And if so, what was your time? And correlate that to the detailed studies you're looking at. Mitochondrial. Talk us through that piece.
Mitochondrial health. Yep.
Yeah, that seems to be a hot topic right now.
It is. Yeah. And it's, it very closely connected with VO2 max.
Oh, is that right?
So, yeah. So the amount of oxygen that your tissues are able to metabolize is really based on, well, not completely, but it's very much based on that oxygen being used at the mitochondria. So yeah, there's good. It's not something that we study a whole lot in my lab, but there is a whole lot of interest in mitochondrial health and how that's related to health span and lifespan. And I'll say that mitochondrial dysfunction, so mitochondria not working properly or as efficiently as they should, is also a hallmark of aging. I think there are 12 or 13 hallmarks of aging now. They're always kind of updating the list.
But that's not something people can request from their, like, there's not a publicly available test to look at your mitochondrial structure without spending thousands of dollars.
Right. No.
Yeah. Okay. No. It's interesting. Coming back to what you're saying about the older folks doing the Ironman, one of the things we've talked about is the 50, 500, and 5,000 day targets in your life. And most people go, 5,000? Like, why would you have a 5,000 day target? That's whatever, 17 years from now. And the idea is you don't know what you're going to care about in 17 years. So it's not a commitment to an achievement. It's the give yourself a chance target. So if you say, and I'm 57, so I might say, yeah, I would like to be able to do an Ironman when I'm 75.
Yeah.
Will I care? Will I be hanging out with my grandkids? Will I be teaching overseas? You know, that's not the question. The question is, could I, or am I going to make choices today that makes that not an option later? And that's where 5,000 day targets can be super helpful to folks at any age of saying 17-ish years from now, I would like the option to choose X. I may not. It's not commitment. I'm not signing blood. It's simply, I'm going to make choices today that keep that on the table versus making choices today it's not a choice.
Yeah, I like that. So, I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, Gordo Byrne got me turned on to the 500 day targets, and then I extended that to 5,000s, and I love that give yourself a chance thing.
What's the philosophy of the 500?
So the 500 day, people tend to get so stuck in a year-long goal or a quarterly goal if you're talking about stock market type stuff. But personally, we tend to set annual goals, and the 500 day is basically a year and a half. And it puts it out a little bit further and says 500 days from now, you're going to X. And if you were to look at my desk in there, I've got a big jar of marbles that originally had 500. And each day when I sit down at my desk, I pull one marble out and I ask myself, am I closer to that 500 day target or further away from this 500 day target? And what choices am I making today that will take me closer? Or am I blowing this off and just saying, well, 500 will come, whatever. So I like the visual, the personal visual. That's not something Gordon and I were talking about. It's just I read it somewhere else and it's helpful. So that's where the 500 thing is.
Gotcha.
Comes in.
I like that.
All right. Any research has tons of challenges. What are some of the challenges in the Healthspan biology, and what are you doing, planning to do to try to overcome some of those challenges that you're coming across?
Yeah, good question. So I think the first thing that comes to mind is connected to much of the stuff we've been talking about already, which is that it may be that 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, we can confidently say that metformin, just as one example, or supplement X, whatever you're interested in, actually promotes healthy lifespan. But it may be different for you from me, our needs for different
right, the individual variability.
Right. Yeah. So trying to understand, and humans are so complex.
Incredibly.
Right? So this is even just at the biological level, we're incredibly different.
Right.
But then you get to the social and the environmental and the upbringing, the nurture. It just
right.
So that's where this whole idea of precision or personalized medicine, I think, really can be helpful, but trying to understand how to do that at scale, this is where I'm going with this. It seems very challenging to me. So we can, the way that we run our studies over here at CSU is pretty compact, and we could, if we wanted to, study somebody almost every day. But even then, in terms of our throughput and our manpower and our ability to analyze the data, maybe we can study a couple hundred people in a year, but that's not going to come even close to capturing the variation that exists across millions of people in the United States, much less billions of people in the world. Right. So yeah, this is something that I think about quite often. Is there some? I have this crazy imaginary scenario that I share with my grad students, and they laugh at me. I think about, 10, 20 years from now, Amazon's going to fly a drone to your doorstep, and you're going to hold your finger out, and it's going to take a prick of blood, and then it's going to do this big workup on all these molecules that we know predict your health outcomes. But right now we don't have that. It sounds wacky, but I don't think it's entirely crazy. Maybe it won't be a drone at that point. They'll have something better, but in the shorter term, is there something that we can do in order to capture what we're looking at much more broadly, and whether that's like mailing people things that they can send in and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I don't think you're far off at all.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm having my blood test tomorrow. The lady's showing up here at 6 a.m. Doing
really?
my blood and leaving. She'll be here for 15 minutes. Boom, done. They'll run those stuff in the lab, get the results, talk with the doc, go from there. So
what service is that?
I don't remember.
Are you allowed to tell? Okay.
Yeah, I don't remember, but they've been great. They're just, you want to come by? I'm like, sure.
Great.
Sounds great. Yeah. Don't have to fast for that one if they're going to show up at 6 a.m., right?
Right. Makes it easy. Yeah.
Exactly. So I was going to ask about future stuff. You already introduced us to one concept there. Mm-hmm. Are there other questions that you're looking forward to exploring in the future that you're not currently exploring? Mm-hmm. Or things you're setting the tone for now because 3 years from now, a year from now, 5 years from now, you're like, oh, I can hardly wait to check this.
Yeah. So two things. One is following that previous thread, which is that everything I described about human variation is very obvious. But in addition to that, there's this problem that this conversation that you and I are having is only going to reach so many years. And there's a lot of people who would live in, what you might call underserved areas, right, or just don't have access to this kind of information. And one could imagine that they might be biologically, psychologically, environmentally, in terms of their exposure, really different from the rest of us. And so let's say we ramp up the data collection, like I was talking about. How do we reach areas like that? And we've got some ideas cooking. We've been thinking about taking our research on the road and doing a mobile research unit. The Healthspan van is what we've been to call it. Yeah.
He's got the logo going.
We do. A little mock-up of it back in the office. And then I think the second thing that I was going to say there is that I think there's a lot of important and unanswered questions about strategies that we already know are good, and timing them and or maybe combining them with either other strategies that we also already know are good, or new treatments or strategies that people might be identifying. That sounds like a lot of mumbo jumbo, but I guess, one example would be the great example that I think has become really popular is this idea of intermittent fasting.
Yes.
So we know that
Mark Madsen was a guest. I don't know if you know
cool.
Mark's stuff.
Yeah. He's fantastic. So, we know that fasting is beneficial, And is there a way that you can make it more accessible to people? Maybe intermittent fasting is something that people can do if they're not into the whole restricting calories all the time idea. Now, what about intermittent fasting plus exercise, right? What about exercise plus some of the drugs or supplements that I've been talking about? And I should say that people have done some of this research. In fact, on our campus, there's research done a couple of years ago showing that this drug metformin that I've mentioned a couple of times actually has an adverse interaction with exercise, or it at least reduces some of the benefits of exercise. People don't have like bad side effects or anything.
Almost like ibuprofen slows the healing process.
Right. Same kind of idea. Right. So, but what I could imagine is that, so maybe that's not the right combination, but maybe there is one. Maybe some of these other supplements that are killing senescent cells, for example, and we know exercise kills senescent cells too. What if you double tap that? Would you get a synergistic effect that would really, reduce the senescent cell burden and thereby reduce inflammation and have this major benefit to health?
How much have you gotten into the IF, intermittent fasting stuff? Is that a path you are comfortable running down, or is it more out there on the margins?
Yeah, I know
just a little bit,
decent amount about it. We don't study it, but I know folks who do.
So Dr. Mattson, obviously most published research in the world on that subject. We got really lucky, had him in, I think, 4 or 5 years ago. But as I continue to keep an eye on it, it seems to me, not researching this subject, just reading a lot on it, that the biggest value is it changes who you are. You no longer are a person who eats when you're hungry, you eat within a window. And the benefits to that is it eliminates the snacks, it eliminates the desserts, it changes your definition of yourself. You are now someone who eats between 10 and 6 or whatever window you choose. Are we actually seeing benefits from what you've seen in the research to the fasting piece, or is it the elimination of the processed foods and we're sleeping better because we're not eating late at night, and the extra serving of alcohol, and I mean, there's a million variables we could both list out here. What's your, just maybe not even research based, but your gut feel on the value of IF based on what you know at this point?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you hit it on the head. I think it's twofold. There is clearly a decent amount of biological effect of that. It's a pretty strong physiological stimulus. The fasting period itself has very obvious biological effects that, and I should say that there are, I wish I could put my finger on it, and I can probably find it and email it to you if you're interested.
Yeah, I can tell your brain is like, I can see it. I can see it.
I remember the exact study, but there was a study that really elegantly showed, it was in mice to be fair, but it did pretty elegantly show that you do need the actual fasting itself, and so that it's not just like the willpower,
the better sleep, the less calories, less processed food. It's not just those things. But there's an additional benefit,
right? And I think, but that's probably why it's so beneficial too, is because it's this biological stimulus that comes with all these additional benefits that are a little bit more than biological, lifestyle, mental, that sort of thing.
Little epigenetics kicking in there. Mm-hmm. All right. So longevity science, everyone's talking about, like we said when we kicked off. Yeah. You touched on this just a moment ago about getting the information out is difficult. How can researchers more effectively get that information out? The old saying about our published journal articles is the average, it's like 70 people read it total, including your friends and family, after you spent 3 years on this study. Yeah. Obviously, that's not doing it unless it's some super headline that the New York Times picks up. In your mind, are there ways that you can, I mean, you're doing it now on a podcast. Mm-hmm. Are there other things that you could be doing, that your peers could be doing, to get some of this critical information into the hands of everybody?
Yeah. I mean, I was going to say the podcast and all the social media around it. I think that was the first thing that jumped to my mind, and I think it's great that there's much more of a discussion about that now. And I really appreciate the people who are doing that now, who are coming from, like yourself, a real focus on the evidence and do it in an evidence-based way, not to disrespect any of the Joe Rogans or anything like that,
but maybe a little.
Fair enough. But the other thing that I've thought about, and I'll confess that it's a little self-plug here too, because this is something that we've pitched along with the Healthspan van idea, is that it's always seemed to me like we do know a lot about aging and how to age well, even if it's coming back to the blue zone points and that sort of thing. But for some reason, there's only a certain percentage of people that are aware of that information and recognize it. And you could contrast that to something like the food pyramid, or it's not the food pyramid anymore, right? It's My Plate, right? So I've just always thought it would be cool if somebody who has that correct skill set and ability to take what we do know and synthesize it into something that's immediately recognizable to thousands and millions of people as like the aging plate. That's terrible. Let's not name it.
Let's do it the clock, the aging clock.
Sure, the aging clock.
And you break that down into different times.
Yeah,
there's your
the aging
picture right there.
We've talked about like a roadmap to healthy aging, something like that, just in a way that can kind of distill and really emphasize that like this is what we do know.
Right.
Anything that's not on this list, we don't know for sure. We have a pretty big focus on brain aging in my lab. And we're doing kind of weird stuff, looking at these biological pathways and trying new drugs and compounds that might reduce inflammation in the brain. And whenever I give talks about this, public talks, I always emphasize at the end, I stop and I go, now, wait a second. All the stuff I told you, please don't go out and buy those compounds. I know that you can buy them on Amazon or on the internet, but here's what we do actually know based on evidence that can promote healthy brain aging. And there's only 3 things. It's exercise, keeping your blood pressure low, and to a limited extent, brain training types of games. Or I shouldn't say games, brain training or cognitive training, but it's really not the games that you can get on an iPhone or anything like that.
Isn't it? It seems like I read something about this just the last few weeks. Isn't it it comes back to getting uncomfortable. It's doing things that you're not used to. So Sudoku they sold so many books because that's going to help your brain. Well, it might at first.
Right.
And then you need to switch to something else. And then you switch to something else. It's the getting out of that autopilot.
Absolutely.
It's country swing dancing. It's tennis. It's hiking. It's something that you've got to really be concentrating on and engaging your brain to allow that. I mean, it's just exercise for the brain.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah, interesting. All right, last couple of questions. Thanks for doing this. This is fun.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Optimal prescription. So you're sitting with let's do 3 different, and I know you're guessing at this. This is just your opinion.
Sure.
3 different landmarks. So a 40-year-old, a 60-year-old, and an 80-year-old. What would be your prescription for that 40-year-old to optimize their aging? And my guess is all 3 answers are going to end up similar, but are there any tweaks that you would make for the 40-year-old compared to the 60-year-old, compared to the 80-year-old? And we're talking so generic here with all the variables we've just talked about. There are a billion different 60-year-olds, a billion different 80-year-olds, but just are there some guidelines to the 40-year-old listening out there that you say, this is the key thing you want to focus on right now that you might be missing? And then the same thing for the 60 and the 80.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm going to repeat again, that just because you used the word prescription.
Fair, very fair.
Not an MD.
Good catch.
And also, I'll just emphasize that this is really, this kind of stuff is not really what we study in my lab, because we're really focused on the biology so much.
This is the extrapolation. Yeah,
just so coming partly from personal experience and from somebody who really reads this literature and is immersed in it, I would say to me, I'm probably leaving something out, but the 3 big things gets back to the blue zones discussion, right? So it's physical activity, healthy diet, and then social connections, however we want to define that. And probably healthy sleep too, but maybe that's kind of wrapped up in some of
Folks, I promise you, I did not slip him $20. So we talk about our 4 cornerstones as move, fuel, rest, and connect.
Are you kidding?
And you just
all right.
Put them in a slightly different order, but you said the 4. So folks, we did not talk about this before. So it's super interesting.
No particular order.
Yeah.
No
doesn't
particular
matter.
order. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So what I would say is that those 4 things are applicable to the 40-year-old, the 60-year-old, and the 80-year-old. However, maybe we can connect back to a couple minutes earlier and point out that for the 40-year-old, there's an argument at least for doing the physical activity, maybe doing all of the above, but for sure for the physical activity, to do it at some level that's a little bit higher and more intense than you might need in your 60s and your 80s, because it gets back to that whole, if you can start high, you're going to decline to a lesser extent, or the place that you end up on the decline is a little bit lower.
So let's chase that path for a second. So why would, because I'm thinking of as a listener, and I'm an 80-year-old going, oh, he just said I don't have to do the intense stuff. And I'm thinking, no, go do if you're able, get in there.
I'll agree with that. Yeah.
Is there a difference in?
Well, I'll agree with that with a caveat, which is that the data on physical activity and exercise show, yes, if you can get after it as an 80-year-old, then yeah, maybe you're going to be able to bring your VO2 max back up a little bit more and prolong, healthy lifespan after being 80, which is fantastic. But where I was coming from is that by the time you've hit 80, for many people, really getting after it comes with some risks. Falling is a much bigger deal when you're at that age. And if you really scrutinize the evidence, the benefit that you get from exercise, it's a diminishing returns at some point, right? So you just walking
bell curve.
Exactly. So just getting far enough up on that bell curve that you're getting the benefits, but not necessarily having to push it to the max. And maybe you want to spend more time with your grandkids or doing your Sudoku, whatever the case may be, right? So, but I would agree though. Certainly don't not do it if you're interested in.
So the move, feel, rest, connect, maybe a little bit more intensity in the 40s. Any recommendations around? You always hear you lose 1% of muscle mass after age 40 per year, into infinity. Is strength training more important in your 50s than it was in your 30s? Is it more important to make sure it's there at 70 than it was at, are there any of those kind of things you're picking up?
I think so. I would just agree with what you just said, basically using those numbers. Yeah. The after you pass age 40, strength training becomes significantly more important, and even more so after age 50. So I think working that in is really important.
Okay. Very good. And then last question for you, put the mirror around. You're doing all this research. How do you see your life changing? How do you see the vision of your own life changing as you look ahead to your life, saying, I'm in the center of this. If anybody's going to do it right, it's going to be me. What is your life going to look like? What's the vision you have for your life at 80 that you kind of have because of what you do for a living?
Yeah, great question. I think we're not that far off from a time and place where I might I'm 45 right now, and I might go to the doc and they might say, you should start taking this, whatever it might be, metformin supplement or something like that, because you're fine and you're working out and, you're eating well and that sort of thing, but why not? Right. So I think that's a reality within the next couple decades.
And for you and your lifestyle, has your plan changed as you've gotten deeper and deeper into this research for yourself? Or has this just been, this is just me, Brad. I probably would have done the same stuff.
No, yeah.
I'm just studying.
I'm a little bit of it, not kind of, probably too much so, but a little bit of self-experimenter, or I think people call themselves biohackers.
Yep.
I won't apply that term. I'm not a biohacker, but I do like trying. I've done some intermittent
Lots of
fasting
N of one
and that
stuff.
sort of thing. Yeah, N of one, that kind of thing. So yeah, I stay on top of this literature, and when I see something that seems like there's accumulating evidence for it, I'll give it a shot. And to the extent that I am not a biohacker, what I don't do is collect a whole lot of data on myself. It's just kind of not my style. But I'll just go by the litmus test of how I feel. So I actually do feel pretty good most days if I don't eat breakfast and I do my workout in the morning, but I don't have any food until around lunchtime or so. And maybe I would have come to that if I wasn't paying attention to the healthy aging literature, but having seen all that literature on it and trying it myself and feeling okay when I do it, I feel pretty confident in doing so. Yeah. That's just one example, I guess.
Okay. So, folks are going to want to follow what you're doing. What's the best way to keep track of you? Are you on social media? There's certain places to go to, a website where they can look at your research and stay up to date on what you're doing.
LaRoccalab.com.
Say it again.
LaRoccalab.com.
Perfect.
Yep.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Tom, appreciate it. This is awesome, buddy.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That was fun. Most of our interviews are done virtually. Tom was in the area and was kind enough to come join us here at the Catalyst Ranch, so we got to do this one face to face and really enjoyed that time. Quick reminder to employers, benefit consultants, and complementary wellness providers. Catalyst Coaching 360 truly addresses the 360 degrees of life. Catalyst not only supports the physical and mental well-being of those you serve, rather, your employees and clients also now have access to Catalyst Elite, our high-performance coaching for those with big goals on the horizon, either professionally or personally. Reach out anytime to discuss details, results at catalystcoaching360.com, or visit the website catalystcoaching360.com anytime. And now, it's time to be that catalyst. This is Catalyst Coaching 360's Dr. Brad Cooper. Make it a great rest of your week, and I'll speak with you soon on the next episode of the Catalyst 360 podcast, or maybe over on the YouTube coaching channel.